Happy 4th of July, guys. I'm recording it, at least, on the 4th of July. I don't know when you're going to see it. Luckily, I have the freedom to be able to put this out whenever I please. I dressed up for the occasion, as you can see. I'd like to also thank my sponsor, Early Onset Diabetes, for this double chin. Luckily, I can cover it up with my flag, though. Today I wanted to emphasize the freedom that we have all around the world, but, in America exclusively, or particularly, we have a great compendium of, it's called a reader, I believe, of great thinkers, philosophers, and writers. Everyone from Aristotle, Darwin, Descartes, Freud, Jefferson, Carl Jung, Thomas Kuhn, Martin Luther King, Margaret Mead, Nietzsche, Reich, B.F. Skinner, Simone Weil, Mary Wollstonecraft, the Buddha, Karen Horney, and Henry David Thoreau. It's going to be the focus of today's episode. Now, I don't know if I'm going to upload this, be able to edit it and upload it, and have the discipline to waste my whole day doing that, or use productively my time doing that today. So I might end up just taking the evening off and crack open some good old cold American brewskis and watch the symbol of freedom burst across the night sky, diffuse its illuminating brilliance across the velvety black summer night sky. In here, not in here. That would cause a house fire. I think I only have one more prop, so let's get it out of the way. I've always been a dissenter from authority. I was one of those kids who always said, "Tell me why. I gotta listen to you." Okay, we got that out of the way. And I think it's a really good question to ask. Skepticism in general is very good. It's healthy for the mind. We need to ask questions. We desire to know. And Henry David Thoreau, along with all these great thinkers, he wasn't inclined to just listen to an authority because it's an authority. What he wanted to know was, what was the person's place in society? What is it that would be the most honorable, noble way to contribute and be a member of your society? And one of his ideas is to exhibit civil disobedience. He was a great thinker in the 1800s in America, and he provoked a sense of responsibility in the individual to really look at themselves inside the society in which they exist and ask, in what way can I be a benefit? Can I bring value to a society rather than be a detriment and ultimately be a burden on other human beings who are also mortal, gonna die, gonna suffer, have their own nonsense to deal with, in short. And he thinks the way to a most coherent society would be for everybody to be civilly disobedient in a way that's true and authentic to them. Granted, and this is a serious thing he's bestowing upon the reader, is that with the assumption that they have already, they have discipline, they have diligence, they have a sense of good, of wanting to do good for themselves, their family, their community, etc. And that they have good intentions, not malicious intentions. So, in the hopes that my voice holds out, I'm going to try to read this whole excerpt on civil Disobedience here. Here's a sketch of Henry David Thoreau, the famous author of this essay in Walden. He, as a background, he lived from 1817 to 1862, so actually he died 2 years before the Civil War in the United States. He began keeping a journal when he graduated from Harvard in 1837. The journal was preserved and published, and I like this because it shows a seriousness, a determination, and an elevation of moral values and characteristics that can be found in all his work. He's best known for the book Walden in 1854, a record of his departure from the warm congeniality of Concord, Massachusetts, in the home of his close friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson himself was, I believe he had a Christian background. He was actually a pastor in some nature. A great thinker of his own accord. But he left, Thoreau left Concord, the city, for the comparative, relative wilds. It's not in the middle of Alaska, but nonetheless it's way more wild than anything I'm used to. Of Walden Pond, where he built a cabin, planted a garden, lived simply. Walden tells of the deadening influence of ownership and extols the vitality and spiritual uplift that comes from living close to nature. It also argues that civilization's comforts sometimes rob a person of independence, integrity, and even conscience. Thoreau and Emerson were prominent among a group of writers and thinkers of their time that were styled the transcendentalists. They believed in something that transcended the material world. Their philosophy was based on the works of Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher of the 1700s, German idealist Coleridge, and the English poet Goethe. Coleridge was the English poet. The German dramatist and writer and poet Goethe. He wrote Faust. All these writers, what they had in common were that they praised human intuition and the capacity to see beyond the limits of common experience. Their philosophical idealism carried over into the plainer social concerns of the day, expressing itself in the works of Walden in Civil Disobedience, what was originally published as Resistance to Civil Government. And civil here meaning not militaristic, just, I believe it's just local governments of the civilians. And although Thoreau all but denies his idealism in Civil Disobedience, it's obvious that after having spent a night in the Concord jail, he had realized he could not quietly accept his government's behavior in regard to slavery. He'd begun to feel that it was not only appropriate, but imperative to disobey unjust laws. And that's a huge theme of this essay, is that the government, again, should be, in his perspective, minimal and subservient to the individual, because ultimately what is the government but the creation of human beings? So it shouldn't be us subject to it, it should be subject to the ideally enlightened and hard-won wisdom of the individual. In Thoreau's time, the most flagrantly unjust laws were those that supported slavery. The transcendentalists were strongly opposed to slavery and spoke out against it. Abolitionists in Massachusetts actively harbored escaped slaves and helped them move to Canada and into freedom. My mom's Canadian, so we got a big-ass blanket with a huge Canadian maple leaf in the background there. Hopefully you guys can see. Nonetheless. So this isn't, not trying to be xenophobic, or even American-centric, Americentric, USA-centric. I'm trying to read this as something that we can apply, something that's applicable to the modern world. This isn't just some dry nugget of history that we can all sit and pontificate over and have nothing come, it not be fruitful. We want to use these ideas. We want to use the history of past human suffering and past human courage. You know, like this guy, he gladly went to jail after being outspoken against slavery and other unjust laws of his time. And we no doubt live in a time that's a little bit better than them, than what they had to endure, but it's not perfect, and it still very much needs to be subject to critical analysis, and we need to be able to understand where we've been so that we don't make those same mistakes, and so that we can feel like we're not just lost adrift in the contemporary world, but we're actually a part of a broader history of slow progress of human evolution. And if not progress as a whole, at least we can latch on and learn valuable lessons from great people, great thinkers, great activists, great disciplined, good, genuinely authentic people, not afraid to speak up when they've done their homework and arrived at the conclusion that what they see, even if it's only a small part of the society around them, is wrong. And I think there's a lot to be learned from this guy's life. So, Fugitive Slave Act, enacted in 1850, a year after this essay was written, was published. It made Thoreau a criminal because he refused to comply with the Massachusetts civil authorities when in 1851 they began to return escaped slaves to the South as the law required. So prior to that, I guess, this Fugitive Slave Act was actually a support of slavery. It required slaves that were even, I forget if there was a line at which if they made it far enough north, they would still be free, they would be protected, but it was penalized by jail time or whatever if you harbored a slave, officially. So, again, because people who were deemed slaves were considered property. And this is a really important thing to know, is that we haven't always had the rights and privileges that we now are granted by birth. It's been a hard one. And there was Jewish slaves 3,000 years ago in Egypt. There were Mediterranean slaves of Mediterranean people, so there wasn't even necessarily an ethnic difference in what made one person a slave to another in the Greek and Roman times. And then modern times, we had, of course, Africans were the main bearer of the brunt of slavery in modern, in the last few hundred years. But it didn't end with them. I mean, there were, especially Irishmen. I don't know enough to elaborate fully on it, but I know, other white people were also slaves. Of course, I guess this would factor into the modern notion of having privilege, because if you are an Irishman, you look very similar to an Englishman, and therefore if you escaped slavery, it would be a lot easier to blend into society than it would be for someone who looked on the outside completely different. So we got to keep in mind, slavery is something that up until just not even 200 years ago was a fairly normal thing. It was very outspoken against by certain people, particularly this guy, but it was, it's a part of our very terrific and our very heroic past. We had the horrific treatment of other people as slaves and property, yet we had other people heroic enough to risk their lives and be killed and be martyred in an attempt slow down, Rich, in an attempt to make known the evil of such behavior. So civil disobedience has been much more influential in the 20th century than in the 19th, the 1800s, when it was written, which is, a brief lesson of how ideas take time to sink into the culture, especially with when you consider people as the mediums through which ideas pass. And if you have a stubborn enough population, those ideas are going to remain in power for a long, long time. So that's why a lot of new ideas, revolutionary ideas, are projected and absorbed by the youth, who aren't necessarily set in their ways yet. And, ideally, if the youth, I'm at the very, very end of my youth, I would say, 30 years old right now, we should be educated enough, we should be vigilant enough, we should be rational and informed enough to recognize what is true and what is false, what is authentic, what may harbor things under the surface that might bring negative repercussions if enacted, unexpected and unintended consequences. That's why history is so important, because so many of the negative things are unintended. You enact certain rules, we don't necessarily always think all of them through. We don't think them out to their logical end, their logical conclusion, and it could be, there's a famous phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So we gotta watch out for uneducated, unwise, good intentions. Mohandas Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, claimed that while he was editor of an Indian newspaper in South Africa, it helped to inspire his theories of non-violent resistance. This essay. Gandhi eventually brought the British Empire to its heels by implementing these theories, helping to win independence for India. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. applied the same theories in the fight for racial equality in the United States. Thoreau's essay once again assumed great import during the latter days of the Vietnam War, when many young men resisted being drafted because they believed the war was wrong and unjust. Civil Disobedience was written after the Walden experience. When Thoreau quietly returned to Emerson's home, he also returned to civilization and discovered his refusal to pay the Massachusetts poll tax, not a tax on voting, but a per-head tax imposed on all citizens to help the Mexican War, landed him in the Concord jail. He spent just one day and one night there. His aunt paid the tax for him. But the experience was so extraordinary that he began examining it in his journal. I really don't write in it much, but I do keep a journal. I haven't written in it probably like a year, but I've had one since me and my buddy started them in like 6th grade, it must be. And God, I gotta admit, it's pretty embarrassing to look back on, but it's also really, really meaningful to see the transition of really just 20 years, I mean, not just, really 2 decades of my life, my most formative years, really. I'm really grateful that I wrote that down. I see my arrogance and my ignorance and my naivety, and I see my budding interest in history and science aimlessly wander around, and I see my influences. If I watch a great movie or I just read a great book, I'll go and like write down in my journal, and it's even just little anecdotes and memories I'd completely forgotten. Like my essay, my teacher I was complaining about, she threw a test on grammar or something like that at us at the last minute. I don't know, very inconsequential stuff, and I was upset because I didn't study, but I was like, I think I got a good grade. Now let's go, ready for summer, I guess. But it was a bad example, but there's a lot of things that I had forgotten all about, and they were really, a part of my history, a part of who I am, what made me act and think the way I do nowadays. And it's really cool. I think it's really important for all of us to, reminisce and learn from the journey of what we've been through. Maybe what we avoided, even. Learn about ourselves a little more. So a brief understanding of Thoreau's approach, his rhetoric, his method of delivering information was mostly oral. He did a lot of writing, but he also gave a lot of lectures, which really is a different type of communication. It depends on a real-time gauge of the audience, and many other things. Thoreau's habit of writing in his journal lasted throughout his life, and though he intended to become a poet after college, he was soon convinced that one of the few ways he could hope to earn a living was by writing. However, he made more money from lecturing on the Lyceum circuit. This was an institution in most New England towns, which I really love the idea of having a lecture circuit. I would go every weekend if there were scientific lecturers, like, sitting there reading data off a graph. If there were actual, imposing, just people with a lot of knowledge and wisdom, I really think that would, maybe I'm just ignorant, and there is around my town, but seems like something that would be awesome. Or at least there should be more of, and it should be more widely known. So, the Lyceum institution in most New England towns resembled a kind of adult education program, featuring important speakers such as Emerson and even foreign lecturers. Fees were very reasonable, and in the absence of other popular entertainment, the Lyceum was a popular proving ground for young speakers interested in promoting their ideas. So so this essay is kind of like a polished bit that, I don't want to degrade it, calling it a bit, like a stand-up bit, but he worked on it and honed it through giving lectures and writing in his journal. So this is, yeah, polished. Civil disobedience bears the hallmarks of the spoken word. It's written in the first person and addresses an audience that Thoreau expects will share many of his sentiments, but certainly not all his conclusions. Yeah, it's just more about the style, his actual delivery. So yeah, let's jump into it. 30 minutes in here.